Super. So I don't think we answered the question. I think, well, we did. Of course, the network architects and network teams should be involved in designing your cloud networks, but not alone, not in a silo, not without collaboration, not without stretching skill sets, and not without looking at the broader business requirements.
Right. So happy Friday to everybody joining. To those who I don't yet know, hi, welcome. My name is Dana. I run corporate communications here at BlueCat, and I'll be opening us up for a couple minutes before passing on to our moderator. Now, for those of you who have not yet joined a Critical Conversations Roundtable, this is the fourth in the series that we're doing. And really all this is a way for us to pull in some of our very best friends very smartest friends from across the IT community and get talking about things that we think need more discussion. We've got a lot of you to thank for the success of this series so far. We started it last September as just a get together for the people who are part of our open Slack community called Network VIP. Since then, we've started seeing names and faces on here representing themselves, but from people who work at our technology partners and our channel partners, our direct competitors, people who are part of other content programs that we do. So I think really that's what community is all about. So thank you all for showing up. If you continue to, so will we. As a sort of a preview of how today is going to go, we're going to spend about 45 minutes talking about the sort of evolving role of the networking team and the networking professional and how that's happening in an increasingly cloudy world. And then we'll do about 10 to 15 minutes of Q&A. At that point, you'll either have the option to unmute yourself. By the way, you're all free to turn on your video if you'd like to do so. We're all friends here. But you'll be able to either unmute yourself and ask the question, or if you're in the Network VIP Slack, you can also pop it into the general channel there. One of my favorite things to do during the roundtable as it happens is to pop my favorite quotes from our panelists right into the Slack general channel. So you'll see me doing that. I invite you to do the same. And I hope that you're going to enjoy this thing. Now, before we get into the actual roundtable and I pass the proverbial mic, I've just got a couple more notes. As we found that this is a pretty interesting topic for a lot of you. We saw the number of people registered for this roundtable. We see the discussion happening in Slack, on LinkedIn about this. So if you want to continue the conversation after this chat on, this cloud and networking and how they all come together, this topic, you've got a couple options. So one, again, the Slack channel's always going to be there for you. Two, our friend and past panelist, Russ White, may or may not be recording a follow-on podcast around a similar topic. So as soon as that is up, we'll be sure to share it with you as well. And finally, and this is something that's really interesting to me in particular, we've partnered with the brilliant analysts over at EMA to actually do a research project exploring the very topic of like cloud and networking collaboration and how these increasingly hybrid architectures are planned and can be planned going forward. So if you've got thoughts on that, we'd love to hear them in the survey that we're going to share soon as well. But without further ado, Andrew, why don't you take us away and help us get into the topic?
Super. Thank you, Dana. Yeah, so today's topic, I think we called Should the Network Architects Design Your Cloud Environment? We actually, Dana and I struggled and went back and forth on potential topics for this. We wanted something that was a little, I don't know, argumentative. But basically, we're just trying to, given what we've heard from you, given what we hear from our customers as we work with our customers, this sort of the iteration number 3, 4, or 5 some of our customers are on in terms of how they're bringing together both domains. It is obviously an area where there's a great deal of interest, discussion, different approaches, best practices, certainly ways to go completely wrong. And part of that is technology, part of that is organization. There's a whole variety of issues around it. So we want to dig into it from a variety of different areas, both sort of from a general networking standpoint and also from a DNS standpoint. But let's start with having the panelists introduce themselves. So who are you? What do you do? And why do you think you're here? Why don't we start with Denise?
Why do I think I'm here? Isn't that like an existential question?
Yeah.
Hi, Denise Donahue. I'm a systems architect for Cisco Systems. I support state of Maryland in the US and some of the county governments. And I need to tell you that I am here as me, however, and nothing I say represents anything that Cisco, it doesn't represent Cisco and not necessarily their opinions. So.
Thank you, Denise. And Ivan?
Ivan Pepelnyak, I'm a network. Don't worry. Everyone gets it wrong.
Yeah.
I'm a network architect at ipspace.net, which is a boutique organization focused on telling network engineers how the vendors are selling them unicorn dust and why that doesn't make sense.
Super. And Ned?
Hi, sure. Yeah, I'm Ned Bellavance. I am the founder of Ned in the Cloud. I mainly focus on creating educational content around cloudy type things, heavily focused on AWS and Microsoft Azure and using Terraform a lot. And I assume that's probably why I'm here, is to sort of expand on some of the knowledge I've gained working in those environments.
Yeah, I think that is why you're here. Super, and because you're charming. Well, let's start with today. So, how are hybrid networks designed today?
Poorly? Is that good start?
Right.
Yeah, a mishmash of things. Yeah, not in a well organized way.
Google based trial fail.
Right.
Repeat.
Yes. Organically, it might be the kinder word for it. I think most hybrid networks have grown organically, especially as they got wired into whatever public cloud deployments were done by business units in an unauthorized fashion. Those have to get tied back into the mothership at some point. So you already have the network that was designed by your network architect and your WAN group. And now suddenly they got to plumb 3 different Azure subscriptions in 3 different regions, as well as maybe some AWS and Google all together. So it's organic. It's just kind of happening. And I don't think there's a whole lot of central planning behind it.
Right. To begin with.
Yeah, to begin with. I see more now as people are actually starting to make cloud be something that is a viable thing. It's not just like somebody's researching something up in the cloud, or they're putting this app there because they're working on it, or developers, etc. I'm seeing, especially in my space, which is a late to adopt space, that people are starting to look at it as, well, maybe we could do a DR site. Maybe we could extend this. We have a couple of apps running up there. Maybe we could take advantage of that. But then it's still really up in the air as far as like, who plans this? Is this the data center team, the server team saying this? And then was it like you were saying, you ask for an IP address space, and that's when the network team finds out about it?
If you think to ask for it. I mean,
Exactly.
So often what you actually have is, oh, I just had this pet project I wanted to try out. And as we all know, the proof of concept for the pet project is what ends up running in production for the next 10 years. And I just accepted the default that Azure picked for me when I set up my VNet. It gave me that 10./16, and I was like, yeah, good. That's fine for my pet project. But the problem is, like, every other VNet that someone has spun up in my organization is using the same address space. And now how do I tie it all together?
And then they want to deploy a shared hub VNet with AD running in it.
Yes.
Yeah, right. Unwinding what was, trying to, I guess, retrofit what they've done into something that looks quasi-planned.
Well, it's worse than that because, you know, they still have that mentality that once you deploy, IP addresses are, you know, carved in stone and unchangeable, even though every server in the cloud is running DHCP and the security groups are dynamically built. So instead of just telling everyone to renumber, which is a decently simple exercise in the cloud, I'm not saying simple, decently simple, people start thinking about netting everything together to the central services, hub VNet. Oof.
Yeah, Yvonne, you just made Ned cringe.
Yes. Oh, okay. I think that you're right that in the sense that you're not going to generally statically assign IP addresses to whatever virtual machines you're running in the cloud, but the people who are writing applications are still using static IP addresses when they're writing their applications. I know they shouldn't be, and they probably should know better.
There's this technology out there called DNS that
never heard of it.
I think can help with that problem.
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah. Is it new?
Yeah. One would hope there was no hard coding of static IP addresses, or even dynamically allocated, and hope they don't change IP addresses in the world of cloud. But obviously that continues to occur.
You know what's worse than using static IP addresses? An IP address hard coded in the source code.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh.
Does that still happen?
Yes. Yes, it does.
Yes.
Because it's the pet project. It's the proof of concept that you never expected to see the light of day in production. So you're like, I can just hard code this in. I don't have DNS locally running on my laptop for whatever domain. So I'm just I'll just hack it in there. It's fine.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's 5 years later and it's, responsible for a chunk of your revenue. And it's a little scary that you have to update it now.
Yeah. And part of it's pet project. Part of it, I think, is also, you know what, if we avoid all of this overhead that those teams apply for no reason that we understand, then we can do stuff faster. And you can always create something faster in a silo than you can when you're looking at the broader architecture. So it might have been designed as a pet project or proof of concept, or it might have been a team that was trying to demonstrate how quickly they can get something done in the cloud, but same result, which is something unplanned that potentially is unmaintainable.
And
Right.
honestly, I don't mind if there's just like one app, one project so much. I don't mind it so much that's developed in the cloud and then becomes something you use. What worries me is the way that people are now looking at cloud way broader. As I have folks looking at it as they're, instead of building out a physical DR site, I'm going to have my DR, my HA site in the cloud. And then when you have just a server team looking at that, then you're not looking at this, all the security, the policies that you need to carry over, the way that the routing is going to happen, the way that failover is going to happen, all the things that networkers look at.
Right. Yeah, and I think there's also, somebody from like a whatever on-premises or physical networking infrastructure perspective doesn't have the ability to go decide to deploy another subnet. It doesn't necessarily understand the ramifications of networking or whatever else. And obviously anybody with the right permissions in Azure or any cloud can go and start creating networks, peering the networks, doing whatever they want, right? Like deciding how egress is going to go. And so it's easier, I think, for people that are naive to sort of the I don't know, the deeper aspects of networking or any of these topics to just go do stuff. It's a playground, it's a sandbox, and so therefore even the quick things they're doing there aren't necessarily planned or well thought out or done for a reason other than, like Ned, I think you said, it was the default.
It was convenient.
It was convenient, right?
And it has to work, so I'll just try random stuff until it works.
Right.
And we're back to RFC 1925 Rule 1, which is seldom where anyone goes past.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, I came up through being a VMware admin to moving to cloud, and my my understanding of networking was mostly driven by what I needed to do to accomplish my job as a VMware admin, which meant I had to understand what VLANs were and kind of like some basic subnetting and whatnot. But anything beyond that, like when you really started getting into any sort of routing, that's where my knowledge just dropped off a cliff. And I think that's where most cloud admins are today, is they had to learn enough to get stuff deployed in the cloud and to run their old VMware clusters. And then they stopped there. And for them, it was good enough. But now you don't have a dedicated network team that's helping you manage your cloud environment. So how do you get that dedicated network team that was helping you in your data center on board with what you threw up in the cloud?
Right.
And it's a whole different thought process too. I mean, you can't just ask a network person, how would you do this or that? Because how it's done in the cloud is different. You've got to make that paradigm shift, which is a training thing.
It's not that much different, because yes, within the cloud, it looks different because, well, everyone has subnets and prefixes and VPCs or VNets, which are like VRFs. Then how subnets behave and what you can route and where you can put the routing table, that's a bit different. But as you start going out, VPN is the old VPN. It's IPsec, point-to-point tunnel, loopback interfaces with static routes pointing to the loopback interface on the other end, and eBGP running between the loopback interfaces. So it's exactly the same thing we've been doing for the last 30 years, only we don't control the other endpoint anymore. But from the config perspective, Azure and AWS, and I'm sure that Google does the same thing, they generate the config for you. You configure the VPN on their side and they tell you, well, now you paste this configuration snippet into your Cisco, Juniper, Palo Alto, yada, 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 yada box, and you're done. And it's standard BGP. The only thing you have to do is, well, you have to understand BGP, which, I understand is a bit hard for some people, but it's been around for 30 years. Come on. And direct connect is the same thing. You have a point-to-point VLAN, you have a subnet on the VLAN, you run BGP over the subnet, you advertise prefixes, you receive prefixes. What's the big deal?
I think the big deal is that line where the cloud vendor starts inserting their technology to take over. For instance, like in AWS, all the restrictions on how you can peer things, and when you're using their VPN gateway, who's going to initiate the connection, and then how routing is controlled between all the various VPCs you might have. Can you put it through a transit gateway? Are you going to try to build a mesh? Like when you get to the cloud side of things, then it's going to have to be a mind meld between the cloud architect who understands enough about the cloud and a network engineer who understands enough about the networking constructs to kind of piece something together.
Yeah, the problem there is then that cloud networks work differently from the thick yellow cables.
Yep.
Because they have to scale. But there are some very simple things to master. Once you forget all the dirty tricks like HSRP and VRRP and moving MAC addresses and all that crap, and you figure out that what they do is they look at the destination IP address and they route it. Once you get that in your head and you forget all the old Ethernet tricks, you're good. And the other thing that everyone does, no hairpinning. So there is absolutely no way that something would come to one of their servers and be sent out because they can't charge for that.
You don't think it's for purely technical reasons?
Well, I just told you the technical reason.
Technically, we're not making money.
Yeah. If you want to have hairpinning, you need the transit gateway, or how's that thing called in the Azure now? VHub or something?
Yeah, I forget what they called it.
Yeah, it's brand new.
Yes, of course.
So you need something which is effectively a scale-out bunch of VMs or bare metal servers or what have you running on top of their cloud network. And then, of course, they are willing to do hairpinning because they charge you twice.
Right. Or you can put some sort of network virtualized appliance in there that you're now going to manage that's
and
doing it for you.
You're charged 3 times.
Oh yeah, because you also have to pay for that NVA that you're running now.
Exactly.
And that's actually where I see when teams involve the network team and the security teams, and just for the record, I really think if you're planning on doing anything really extensive with the cloud, you need to involve the network and security teams. Just want to make sure I make that point. But what I see is immediately the network and the security teams want to put a virtual router and a virtual firewall up there.
Yep.
Just because that's what they know.
Yes.
That has been my experience on any large cloud project I did when I was doing a lot of consulting, is whenever the network or security team got involved, rather than trying to learn the constructs that were available in one of the public clouds, they instead just wanted to go spin up the virtual version of what they were running on-prem, which like I totally get from an administrative standpoint. Like I get the same interface. I can run the same policies, but the company is going to be paying a lot more for that NVA and possibly getting less functionality out of it because now that device becomes a bottleneck.
Right.
Yeah, and less performance.
The argument to that, however, is that you're putting your assets, your company assets on the cloud. Security is paramount. We've seen how many hacks, SolarWinds, everything else. So I'm a network guy, but I have a security background as well. And without those firewalls, you're just giving away your secrets to the Chinese and whoever else wants in. That's the bad idea, right? That's why security still is paramount. You can't just discount it.
I don't think anybody. Yeah, you can't. Of course, you can't discount it. The question, though, are there different ways in that domain to solve for those requirements, and do those different ways even, maybe solve in a more, actually give you more capabilities than the way you were solving on premises. So it's a different domain. Those require, obviously there's still security requirements for sure, but are you going to have segmented networks in the cloud, or are you going to segment them with a virtual appliance and use your own firewalls? I mean, there's depending on the use case, there's usually cloud networking capabilities on the security side, core networking side that meet those requirements. And again, in some ways in a simpler way. We talked about before about hard coding IP addresses and those sorts of things. You deal with security policies that can be specific to an instance of something as opposed to an IP address. And it's a different way of approaching the same set of requirements.
Right. I think the real trick is the fear of letting that control be residing anywhere but in-house. I mean, security being paranoid is the way I approach things. I am paranoid when it comes to security, so I would retain as much control as possible, which is why firewalls, for me, that I manage, that are not touched or controlled by the cloud providers or anyone else but the company involved, is, yes, likely more expensive.
But it doesn't sound like you're ever going to get to the cloud if security is number one. Like, how are you ever going to convince your organization to actually get to the cloud, right?
No, it's the business people. Business people are the ones who make that decision. We, as the technical people, are just told to implement it. We can make our arguments, but at the end of the day, the shareholders dictate that the cloud is the way to go because it's the new shiny object. So we're left with, it's a bad idea. But that said, we are still going to do our job to make sure it's as secure as possible, even though we disagree with the business drivers to get there in the first place.
Yeah, but now realistically, if you are so concerned about security, you do understand that they own routing, right? Mm-hmm. They are the ones deciding whether they will even send the packets to your firewall.
Totally agree. Totally agree.
So isn't it better to use their security controls if you're using their packet forwarding mechanisms and their routing tables and their everything else? I mean, I have nothing against people bringing their own firewalls into the cloud if they love that. I'm okay with that. It's just that sometimes your firewall doesn't add any value. For example, you have MySQL traffic going from your web server to your database server, or Oracle traffic, or whatever.
So here's the kicker on that. And as we all know, in the cloud security world, ultimately speaking, if you store data on the cloud and it gets hacked, the only person who's responsible is the company, not the cloud provider. So yes, you're right. The cloud provider does all the routing, all that packet, all that stuff. End of the day, the lawsuit comes to the company. So that's why the argument is keep as much of it in control, your control, as possible. Because at the end of the day, you're on the hook.
Right, but there's no control. That's an illusion. And what Ivan's trying to tell you is that you have no control. You can put your firewall out there, but if the traffic's not going through that virtual interface, you have it's a false sense of security, no?
Yeah,
Well,
and if someone breaks into your cloud account and changes the routing on that cloud account, and all of a sudden, all the traffic bypasses the firewall, which is perfectly possible if someone has the keys of the kingdom.
Right.
What value will the firewall bring?
Simple.
Apart from insurance policy?
That's what it is. And that's what it is. When you get sued, when you get sued, you can say, we did everything we could to secure it. And at which point, hopefully the courts say, well, you did due diligence. Therefore, you're off the hook.
This is like the
everyone
tick
gets
box.
hacked, right?
This is like the tick box that says, yes, we have the IPS. It's powered off and it's not connected to anything, but we have it and it's in the rack. So,
right.
Well, that's a
one
business
can make that
decision.
argument.
A business,
Well,
yeah.
I mean, if we're just talking about protecting ourselves against auditors, because that's what we're really talking about here, is not actual security. We're talking about protecting ourselves against the auditors.
Yep.
I would make a case that you can pass the audit no problem using all the cloud native tools and not putting your own firewalls in there. At the number of certifications that all of the public clouds have pretty much cover whatever your auditor is going to be looking for. And I can see putting a firewall in there, but I also think that the products that the cloud vendors are putting together are going to be just as good, if not better, since it integrates better with their existing networking. Like Ivan was saying, they own the routing plane for it. So if they're going to put their own firewall device in there, then it's going to be a lot more difficult to get around that than it is a device that you put in yourself.
well, this comes down to business requirements in the sense that your cloud vendors are providing services because it makes sense. Whether those services meet the needs or whether you want to put your own appliances in shouldn't be viewed as a paradigm of cloud versus not. It should be looked at, okay, what is most effectively going to meet our business requirements and is going to meet our business strategy. And if that's using some features from the provider and some features that you bolt on yourself or some combination thereof, it ultimately comes down to business decision and strategy, not whether the cloud way of doing it is correct or whether the old-fashioned bolt on the firewall way of doing things is correct.
Yeah, I agree.
It comes down to, right, you got to understand the requirements, and then you need the right knowledge to go, solve for those requirements and do it in the right ways and the right domains with the appropriate tool sets. And we have this conversation all the time, but it's arguably you can secure things in any green field more than you can when you're trying to secure something with all of the constraints of existing infrastructure that you can't change, or it's other people's jobs or whatever the case, certainly from an auditing and a logging and all that, like it's greenfield, the tools are there. It comes down to understanding. So somebody made a comment that, the sort of the traditional networking folks really need to sort of up-level their skills if they're going to help us with the cloud. And, at the same time, we hear people saying, the skill set and the knowledge of people doing this in the cloud is so limited that there's, they're not going to do it well, or they're not going to do it correct, or they're going to choose the default. So it's I think there's that perception on both sides, which is you're not knowledgeable enough to help me, and exactly the same thing on the other side, or maybe you're too slow, or you're going to, and look, I don't think this can be done well, mostly on the architecture side, if you're not bringing together the appropriate skill sets that are trying to solve for the requirements across the appropriate domains, and then splitting off where the designs can be local. And as long as the controls are in place and the requirements are being met, then you can continue to have that level of I don't know, agility, speed, whatever. But you're not slowing everything down with some massive waterfall build of a network. But I think it takes a different mindset, and I don't think there's a right answer here of should everybody needs to be involved. You know,
that's key.
But so Andrew, that was going to be my question to the panel, and Ned and Denise sort of touched on it a little bit about who to bring together. We talked about the cloud team and the network team. Do you think like the average network person has, you know, over the 20 years been exposed enough to for loops and REST APIs and the new modern programming way of doing things? Or at what point do we need to bring in a true developer into the mix with the network and with security and with that? That's what I'm here today here. At what point is this a developer's job now and not even the network engineer's job?
And of worms opened.
Yeah. But let me just, but my point on architecture, and Ivan, I'll let you chime in a second, like is, you know, at some point are we building out architectures that are going to meet the company's requirements? How we're actually going to go build the different components of those architecture, and maybe we're going to drive it completely through automation here. You know, maybe we're putting cables and switches over here, whatever the case might be. That you know, if you're not sort of working off of a agreed upon architecture to begin with, then yeah, like you don't want people, if they can write REST APIs or not, you know, what doesn't matter what their programming skills are. If there's no requirements that they're trying to meet that can be tested against and audited, and then it's going to be a mess. I don't care if they're doing it manually or automated, right? I was just, you know, that's where I think at least it needs to start is understanding what the requirements are and not assuming that that the way we've always done things that meets the requirements. So let's just repeat that in the cloud.
Well, I think
exactly.
That speaks to the point of you have to know what's possible before you can architect the solution. So having the requirements is obviously really important, but also understanding what's now possible with some of the technologies in the cloud as an alternative to the way that you traditionally do things is important as well. And that's probably 100%. Where the melding of those who are familiar with the cloud versus those that are familiar with traditional network architecture really need to talk to each other a little bit instead of talking, you know, past each other to figure out, okay, this makes the most sense based off these requirements. We can implement this thing. And then you can get to the how, the for loops and the programming against the API and writing configurations. But before all that, you have to know what's actually possible.
Yeah.
Well, not even before I'm sorry, Ivan. Do you want to go?
Go on. No, go on.
Okay. Even before the what's possible, you need the what. Just like Andrew was saying. And not just like the what is that we need to firewall off this and this, or that we need to route here and here, but the what is, this is what we're putting up here. This is what we're going to do with it. This is who should access it, how they should access it. You know, the really, really high level design, but that's also the most political part of it. Right. And I think that's like with any really, you know, high powered construct you have, the deciding on the what is much harder than the how. Because once you know the what, then you can say, oh, we could use this native cloud, you know, this built-in thing for this. We could use, nobody's mentioned NSX and ACI and all that yet. So I'm going to throw those out there. You know, we could use some constructs from there for that. We could use the firewall for this. We could, you know, that's the critical part to me. And that's the part that you really, really need to have people from different teams working together on. And I've only seen that happen once, to have everybody with the same goal in place of making this right, doing it right for the company.
And that speaks to what we covered off the top, that often these requirements show up on our door after they've already built the environment. And that's the real challenge, I think, for most people is, I've built this awesome Azure environment. It does everything I want, put it in the cloud. What? And therein lies the problem that we face. Is I think we would all agree here that if these projects had been handled from top down with consensus from the beginning with all parties involved, then it'd be easier. But oftentimes, as you said, we get them after the fact, or we get a legacy application that's been running for 30 years coded in COBOL. Let's put that in the cloud with all those static IPs. Same idea. Yep.
Yeah. So what?
Yvonne's been trying. Hang on. Yvonne's been trying to talk for so long.
Yeah, I know. I cut him off. You cut him off. Let's cut him off.
We all cut you off. You need to be bolder.
Usually I am. Anyway, back to John's question. You have to understand that cloud networking is slightly different. We discussed that. And then you have to put yourself in the shoes you were in when you were at a CCNA or CCMP level. So you have to start going through the documentation. You have to read everything that AWS or Azure put out about networking. It's not that much. In a week, you're done. And you don't care about the API. You don't care about CLI. You don't care about the configuration objects and JSON and YAML and all that stuff. What you care about is the same thing you cared about when you were preparing for the CCMP exam. How does this thing work? And what exactly is possible and what is not possible? And then you try to figure out why it works that way. And that gives you the knowledge to design stuff on top of that that will, fit well with what the cloud can do. You don't want to fight the cloud. You go with the cloud.
Right.
And then after you've done that phase,
put that quote in the Slack room. You don't want to fight the cloud. You want to go with the cloud. That's beautiful. Okay, sorry, go.
And then you start thinking about, how will I deploy this? Will it be this through GUI? No, hopefully not. Will it be Terraform? Will it be Ansible? Will it be API with Python? I don't care. It's like discussing, are we configuring Juniper or Cisco? I don't care. Are you using SSH or console cable? I don't care. Design the stuff and then let someone configure it.
We're getting all tied up in the how rather than the what.
Yeah, no,
exactly.
No, exactly. So what are some? So we've seen several interesting byproducts of poorly designed cloud on-premises networking and connects. Everything from segmented networks that are routable back through the data center, so you're paying more for no security and reducing performance, like all sorts of good intentions that led to poor results. Are there any sort of war stories, things you've seen out there that you should not attribute to any specific company?
Like stretching a subnet into the cloud and using host routing to figure out which IP addresses are on this end and which IP addresses are on the other end.
That's a good one.
And using Lisp for that just because Lisp.
Yeah.
So that's like the icing on the cake.
Yeah.
I'd like to say I've never seen that. I'd be lying. Yeah.
Let's add Lisp. That makes everything better.
I certainly saw on more than one occasion where an organization had a security stack that they really, really wanted to use at one of their data centers. And so they were pulling all traffic from their Azure locations, backhauling it to that central data center to filter it through their security stack and then send it egress out to wherever. Definitely saw that at multiple organizations, and it always resulted in really poor performance, especially when the Azure region happened to be, in Japan, and the data center that they were sending it back to was in Philadelphia. So it's suboptimal, you might say.
Oh, they encountered latency?
Yeah, I know. Imagine that.
Yeah.
Literally around half the planet.
We see that one all the time. All the time.
How about not using transit gateway or doing things before transit gateway was a thing, and instead of full mesh of VPC peering, pulling all the traffic back home through direct connect and doing on-premises routing between VPCs?
Yeah, that was my point before. Like, and that you're paying more for less performance and no more security. It's because somebody's decided you're not allowed to peer those two things.
Or you couldn't figure out how to peer them, but you already had the router in place.
Right. Yeah. There you go. Fastest path to get done versus networking. Interesting. On the DNS side, we've seen companies try to utilize the auto-generated names for specific, like in AWS, like an EC2 instance that has the IP address basically in the name. It's basically a IP address, and go deploy those all around the company and use them where they really only make sense in running in that VNet or VPC. They're not Azure's private DNS or Route 53. They're the auto-generated name that may change or may not change or might be duplicate across services, or it's not something that should leave that that network. And so we've seen some interesting failures based on that.
Well, I'd be interested in hearing the flip side of that. What have you seen work really well? Where have you seen, people succeed in doing this? Have you seen? Maybe I should put it that way.
Well, it always starts with a presentation on like, okay, so here is our fifth iteration of cloud networking. Like for our customers that seemingly are doing things very well, there is, like it's whatever, step one in AA, like they realize they've had a problem and they've decided they can't just patch this problem. They need to sort of rethink this architecture and try to standardize an architecture and have the right people involved. And even then they go through a couple different iterations because at the same time, the company's decided that, we're going to switch over to SD-WAN. We're not going to use this direct connect anymore, or, whatever the other broad changes. So they keep iterating, which is a good thing, but it's usually the ones that are doing well started with failure.
Yeah, it also helps if they have some small isolated project that they deploy into the cloud that is not dependent on any data back home. And so they slowly gain, familiarity with the cloud and how things work, and then slowly build from there. But people who drink the Kool-Aid and think that you can just lift and shift existing mess into the cloud get the results they deserve.
Yeah, the most successful ones that I've seen have implemented a certain amount of self-service with guardrails for the groups that want to consume cloud. So, if they do want to deploy a new VNet or a VPC, there's a template that they can fill out and it'll pre-populate some information for them. So they don't have to worry about getting that, block of IP addresses or whatever from the network team. But it also puts the safeguards in place to make sure the network's actually being routed properly and going through the necessary security pieces. Admittedly, like you said, that's not something that comes, fully baked out of the gate. That's something they've gone through some pain already to realize, oh, we do need to put up guardrails, and we need to make it self-service enough that people aren't going to, go around to those guardrails and swipe their own credit card because we've made it so difficult to consume. So that's where I've seen the biggest success.
By the way, Ned, I know that at least AWS has this tool that sort of auto audits your configs and points out discrepancies between your policy and what has actually been configured.
Yes.
Have you seen anyone using that tool?
I haven't seen it in AWS. I have seen people using Azure Policy to sort of apply the same thing. So with Azure Policy, you can do the same thing. You can basically set up rules that will audit, and it will, flag it if it doesn't exist or it's configured wrong. And now they've added the ability to automatically remediate certain issues. So if it finds that you've added a firewall rule that, violates one of the policies, it'll pull that firewall rule out, or at least send something to a particular team where they can click a button and get it expunged. So I have seen that being put into place, not so much on the AWS side.
It goes. The other aspect of this is, and made me think of this, Ned, when you talked about guardrails, is, oftentimes, especially if you're deploying a net new, more modernized architecture application, then part of your deployment process is creating potentially networks and creating, a security policy and everything else that's involved with it. Step and repeat because you need to deploy this across multiple places. You need to be able to rip it down, build up a new one. And so, yeah, I agree with those guardrails are important. I think if instead the expectation is all that stuff is set up ahead of time, and you're setting up more general networks for these sorts of applications versus these sorts of applications, you might be driving more of a legacy paradigm towards the way you're utilizing the cloud. And so I think I completely agree with you on self-service with guardrails. abstract away the stuff that those that are deploying don't necessarily need to know, and make sure stuff is working in the background, but at the same time, don't take away their ability to drive, automate the deployment of all the infrastructure they need within those guardrails to deploy their applications.
Right. And that's the sort of thing where if you're using Terraform, you can have a private registry of modules that are approved for use. So
Right.
they can still consume those modules. It has a bunch of, sane defaults baked into those modules that they can then consume. But hey, there's some new service that you want to try out in Azure or AWS. Okay, let's try it out, see how it works, and then we can work together to build a new module that lets you deploy out that service as well.
Yeah, and honestly, people don't want to deal with that stuff. Developers want to have stuff deployed.
Yeah.
They don't care about networking and routing and security and all the other stuff.
Down. Yeah.
So if you give them the templates that they can use, and they just use a template, and they get a new environment and they can deploy their stuff on there and it works, great.
They should care, Ned. Ivan, they should care a bit more, right? Because you're now.
Well, we all agree on that.
Yeah. But you're architecting an application specifically for the cloud that's going to be highly available across a couple different availability zones or a couple different regions, and
Yeah, but
you need to make sure that your VPC has networks that are, I think it's an opportunity for the application developers to understand more about networking and security if they're actually going to design this thing appropriately. I get the point you are making, but I think
my pushback on that is, how well do you, and not you specifically, but us as network practitioners or cloud practitioners, how well do we understand the guts of programming? Because the programmers could push back on us and be like, well, you should understand better about programming, and
set up your routing to fit our program, huh?
Right.
This is the curmudgeon factor.
We do have to meet them halfway, like a little bit on that, and not expect them to have a really in-depth knowledge of everything having to do with security and networking. They should have that base layer in the same way that I understand kind of how to do some programming, but I'm not going to write you something in C++. I'm just not that in depth with it, but I have an understanding of basic concepts in programming. We should expect the same from them, but not any deeper than that level.
The strange thing that we have in IT, and I'll go back to what I called the curmudgeon factor, is that despite the fact that we're in an information-based industry, there are so many of us who just don't want to learn. The programmers don't necessarily want to go beyond their perspective. Your average networking person doesn't want to go beyond their perspective. The average security person is quite happy with their security perspective. They get the other perspectives are out there, but the idea that we can't hand it off to someone else and let them take care of it is a very odd thing in the industry, but it's there.
Are you saying people are lazy?
No, yeah, actually, that's exactly what I'm saying.
I wouldn't even say that.
But you don't need everybody to be generalists, right? I mean, you've got people with a tremendous amount of depth and skill in one area, and you don't necessarily want them to be complete generalists, which is the other side of that curmudgeon. But there's certain roles, certainly on the architecture side, whether it's software architecture or network architecture or security architecture, where you better have some broad general knowledge. And if you're an architect, I think, and you're not constantly trying to expand that knowledge, then you're not fulfilling the requirements of your role.
Yeah, we may not need to know it, but we need to appreciate it. Sorry, Ivan, go ahead.
Yeah, no, there are like 3 levels of knowledge, if you wish. You have what I call practitioners, and then you have people who could rightfully be called engineers, and then you have people who maybe deserve the title architects. Right. And for practitioners, I totally get it that they don't want to know anything left and right of them, but then they should stay practitioners. They should, code, they should configure VLANs, they should create database indices, I don't know what else, firewall rules, and stay away from having opinion about anything else. On the other hand, what Andrew mentioned, the multi-region, scale out, highly available application, that's a really tough thing to do. And it involves like 5 different cloud services, regardless of which cloud you look at. And it involves the proper application architecture. And it involves the understanding that you can't get it unless you get rid of transactional view of the world. You have to have the eventually consistent databases with some sort of, conflict remediation between those databases. There is no other way to get that done. And that involves everyone. But of course, not everyone needs to know all the details. All a programmer needs to know is that you can't count on something being written appearing in another region at the same microsecond.
For sure, which goes back to architecture. But like done best, you've got those that the practitioners and to some extent engineers have the information they need to do their job without having to go consider those things separately. They know, right? It's built into a test case. It's whatever the case might be. So what can network professionals do to ensure they're on the right side of this?
Talk to their peers in the other silos. Try and break down those silos. Try to make it easy for them to come to us. Don't be the enemy.
Learn about how cloud actually works. Don't try to, lift and shift your 40 years of thick yellow cable history into the cloud networking.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. Ned?
Well, I mean, I'm not a network professional. I don't know if I want to give an opinion on that. I don't want to sound like I'm talking across the aisle here.
But isn't that great? Because you are. See, we don't bite.
Yeah, do better.
Y'all can talk to
us. I think just to share one of my experiences when I was a young sysadmin learning VMware and trying to get into teaming networks together for network cards together. And I wanted VLANs and all this stuff. And I was terrified to go talk to the network team because they were not friendly. And that has not always been my experience at different organizations I've worked at, but it has been my experience more often than not that the networking team was very disagreeable when it came to people coming to them needing things. And I get it. Like, it's not an easy job, but I think we could all be a little kinder to the people that we work with. And like you were saying, Denise, like try to break down those silos. May not break down the silos, but poke some holes in the silos for a little communication back and forth. That would work wonders.
Okay,
I think part of that unfriendliness is this constant barrage of people assuming, not understanding the complexity, asking questions that they think they should have a simple answer for, or for you to do things that they think they should be able to do right away. And then there's this always like, it wasn't necessarily arrogance. It's more like, these questions aren't even qualified. Like you don't even understand what you're asking, and yeah.
But Ned, do you feel that that's part of, Ned, do you feel that that's tied into VMware specifically, where that's the first time the compute team is suddenly doing all the networking? And why is it not just the networking team doing this? And now that's carried forward into cloud, where it's still the compute team doing the networking and they're doing it wrong and they don't know what they're doing. Is that part of that? Why did compute end up with the keys to the castle instead of network for VMware and for, let's say, for virtualization and now for cloud computing?
Yeah.
What's up with that?
I can answer that one. VMware was always selling to sysadmins.
Oh, yeah.
And the networking people were those idiots who were always saying, this is not how you should do things.
Or
bridging without spanning tree in the hypervisor, this is not how you should do things. Port channels without LACP, this is not how you should do things. sending traffic immediately when the interface is up, not waiting 30 seconds. This is not how you should do things. And VMware was always like, oh, those people don't know a thing. Listen to us. We are your friends and they are your enemy. Sorry about this rant.
It's okay to stretch layer 2 across the
Yeah, exactly.
WAN.
It's perfectly fine to stretch layer 2 into the cloud now with NSX.
Yeah.
It's perfectly fine to vMotion a VM into AWS. It all makes perfect sense. Buy from us.
Latency is not a thing. It's an illusion.
Anyway,
like
what Ned said before about, the unfriendliness of networking people. Seeing people on the other side of the L and being one of them years and years ago, the usual problem is that no one involves the networking team when any project is started. The networking team is involved on Friday afternoon when they have to do an impossible task so that the application will go live on Sunday morning. And if somehow we could fix that process and bring someone from the networking team into the room when the next project is designed, and having that networking person have some input on how the project would be designed so that it would be easier to implement, and that, oh my God, there is this thing called DNS and maybe you should use it, then everyone's life would be much simpler. And it's not just networking. It's the same thing with security. It's the same thing with network services like load balancing. It's the same thing with even sysadmins and virtualization people. We all get handed crap that shouldn't have existed in the first place, and we are asked to implement that.
So, Ivan, I'll just mention one thing in regard to that participation. It's a continuing trend. I think most will agree. Too many IT departments, we were talking about siloing earlier, too many IT teams take the approach and complain, why are we not included? But I would turn around and say to IT leadership, why are you not jumping in? Why are you not including yourself in the business and in the requirements and the projects and the needs of the business and stepping forward to be that partner? Don't wait for someone to come to you. They're going to come to you after it's too late. You got to be there, and you got to show that you are business focused and not just technology focused.
Oh, that's beautiful.
I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
I haven't heard that voice in 15 years. Is that you, Jesse?
Maybe.
Yeah. I was the vendor 15 years ago, and Jesse was at the customer, and I was in there saying, no, just do this, do this, do this. And Jesse was the guy telling me no.
Smart guy.
Jesse, if I can piggyback off that, some of the best organizations that I've seen functioning have a really strong enterprise architect group that is involved with the business teams. And when they see a project coming, they can reach out to all the other constituents, the network and the storage and the backup and all those teams, and bring them in, or at least be the voice of those teams when these decisions are getting made at the higher level. And,
in the super world there, that team is plugged in deeply with the business, understands how the business is investing and what their main initiatives are over the next couple of years, and are starting to design things ahead of time that they can flex to meet the needs, as opposed to sort of like a project-based where it's project after project after project. That's the nirvana, I think, but it starts at that architecture level and that collaboration with the business. IT in general, I don't care which silo it is, IT in general always, was brought in too late based on what the business needed.
So we all agree it's the business's fault.
Yeah, it's them. It's them.
Yeah, if the business could just realize that they only exist so that we can string up networks, then it would be a lot easier.
They have another purpose.
So networking people need to know the cloud. They need to know virtualization. And they need to know the business. So,
yes.
The network,
honestly,
the network is easy. You got to know the rest of this stuff.
You know what? It's kind of tongue in cheek, but it's not entirely wrong. If the network is foundational to all of this, then we have to know what's being built on top of what we're building.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And get plugged in and understand how many layers of overlay will be in whatever you've laid down.
Yeah. And Denise, honestly, everyone in IT should understand what the business is doing and who is paying their paychecks and why is the money coming in.
I completely agree. Wrote a book about it. No. Go buy it. I need that 60 cents.
Back to a question.
Agree.
Right. Back to, I think, Denise, a question you asked earlier is where does this work well? And I think that's one tenet of it is, that plug in with the business, understanding not just what they need today, but where they're going.
Hey guys, I'm just going to pop in here. We're at time, and I know some people might have to jump on to say big thank you before you go. Bye, Ned. Thank you so much.
Bye. Thank you. It was a great conversation. Ned. Bye, everyone.
I mean, if you guys want to keep chatting, go for it, but I just didn't want Ned to feel like he had to jump away and sort of sneak away doing it. Continue.
Well, no, I think that wind up was great.
Yeah.
I think the way you wound it up, Andrew. And I just want to say to Chris, I want to send you out law for having the book.
Super. So I don't think we answered the question. I think, well, we did. Of course, the network architects and network teams should be involved in designing your cloud networks, but not alone, not in a silo, not without collaboration, not without stretching skill sets, and not without looking at the broader business requirements. All right. Well, I want to thank you all for joining, the panelists and everybody who participated. That was fun.
Yes, it was.
Thank you all for your time.
You.
Yeah,
Thank
super.
you all.
Thank you all.
Weekend. Yvonne, you can put that bourbon in your tea now.
Yeah, don't worry.
Good to see you again, Yvonne.
Yeah, great seeing all of you.
All right, see you.
Bye, everyone. Have a great
Bye.
weekend.